In the spring of 1796, the streets of London buzzed with rumours of a miracle. A lost Shakespeare play had been found, hidden for centuries, now revealed at last. Scholars swore it was genuine, collectors paid fortunes for the fragments, and at Drury Lane Theatre an audience of thousands gathered to witness the return of the bard himself. But before the curtain would fall, the dream of Shakespeare reborn would dissolve into chaos, scandal, and disgrace. This is the forgotten story of William Henry Ireland, the young man who deceived London's greatest minds, ruined his own family, and staged one of history's most audacious literary frauds. A tale of obsession, lies, and the desperate hunger to believe. If you're new here, welcome to the Macabre Record, where we uncover the shadows of history and the scandals the world tried to forget. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the past. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? The air inside Drury Lane Theatre was thick with anticipation on the evening of March 23rd, 1796. Thousands had crowded into the playhouse, their whispers swelling like the hum of a restless sea. Some came out of reverence for Shakespeare, eager to witness what was being hailed as the rediscovery of a lost masterpiece. Others came out of curiosity, their imaginations stirred by the promise of a voice returned from the grave. Gentlemen in powdered wigs leaned forward in their boxes, fanning themselves against the heat of the lamps. Ladies in silks clutched their programmes, their eyes darting toward the stage, as if they might glimpse the ghost of the bard himself lingering in the wings. The actors, behind the curtain, shifted nervously, aware that this performance was no ordinary debut. The play they were about to perform bore the title Vortigern and Rowena, presented to the world as a work of Shakespeare that had miraculously survived the centuries. To those who believed, this was history unfolding. For Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the theatre manager, it was a gamble, a spectacle too tantalising to resist, but one that teetered on the edge of disaster. He knew the eyes of London's critics were trained upon him, ready to pounce on any misstep. When the curtain finally rose, silence fell. The opening lines were delivered with trembling solemnity, and for a moment the spell held. The audience leaned in, hearts racing, as though they were indeed hearing the lost words of England's greatest poet, but almost at once something felt amiss. The rhythms faltered. The words, instead of soaring, stumbled awkwardly across the stage. Murmurs stirred in the pit, rising and falling with each clumsy verse. The actors, straining to maintain composure, pushed forward, though they too must have sensed the hollowness of the lines. By the second act, scattered chuckles began to break the tension. What should have been stirring poetry drew uneasy laughter. Critics exchanged knowing glances. The murmurs became bolder, the laughter sharper, until the atmosphere in the theatre was charged with ridicule. What had begun as a miracle was unravelling before their eyes. Sheridan's gamble was slipping into fiasco. And yet, in that moment of collapse, one question burned brighter than all the jeers. Who had dared to pass this off as Shakespeare? How had a work so flawed and counterfeit been accepted as genuine? The answer would lead not to the grave of the bard, but to the study of a young man desperate to please his father, a boy named William Henry Ireland. To understand how London's greatest theatre became the stage for ridicule, we must step back from that chaotic night and look to the roots of obsession that fed it. For in late 18th century England, Shakespeare was not simply a playwright. He was a national monument, a source of cultural pride elevated almost to the status of a saint. Every scrap of his existence was treasured, every rumour of discovery pursued with feverish devotion. Scholars lamented the lack of authentic manuscripts, collectors scoured the country for relics, and publishers paid handsomely for anything that could be linked to his name. The bard was England's immortal voice, yet his personal traces were tantalizingly scarce. And where there is scarcity, there is desire. It was into this climate that Samuel Ireland, a man of letters and a devoted worshipper of Shakespeare, built his own quiet shrine. He was a collector of prints and curiosities, a man who longed above all else to be associated with the great poet. Samuel's shelves groaned with volumes of Shakespeare's works, His walls were adorned with engravings, and his conversations often circled back to the genius he adored. To Samuel, a genuine relic from the bard would be the ultimate prize, a treasure to elevate his name and secure his place among the learned men of London. But Samuel's passion was also his weakness. His yearning was so deep, so unguarded, that he became a man waiting to be deceived, and the deceiver would be none other than his own son. William Henry Ireland was a quiet boy, often overlooked, eager for his father's approval. Where Samuel was confident and scholarly, William was timid, prone to seeking validation. He watched his father's obsession with Shakespeare with a mix of admiration and despair, knowing he could never compete with the dead poet who seemed to occupy more space in his father's affections than William himself. Then came the moment of temptation. William worked as a clerk in a solicitor's office, where he had access to old documents, parchments, and the tools of imitation. Surrounded by antique paper, seals, and ink, he recognized the possibilities. What if he could give his father the relic he craved? What if, by his own hand, he could conjure Shakespeare back into their lives? It was not malice that guided his first steps, but a desperate wish to be loved and admired. And so, the stage was set for one of history's boldest acts of literary fraud. William Henry Ireland had never stood out in school, nor did he shine in the company of his peers. He was awkward, soft-spoken, and always on the margins, overshadowed by stronger personalities and loftier talents. His relationship with his father only deepened this sense of inadequacy. Samuel Ireland's passion for Shakespeare was overwhelming, a love so fierce it left little room for his son to compete. William craved affection and recognition, yet in his father's eyes he seemed destined always to disappoint. Each day in the solicitor's office, surrounded by the dust of ancient papers and the faint odour of ink and wax, he felt himself drifting further into obscurity. But those same dusty shelves offered him something else, possibility. Among legal parchments and discarded documents were scraps of vellum and aged paper that carried the patina of time. In the dim light of the office, William studied their texture, the curling edges, the watermarks half worn by decades. He handled the quills and ink with an intensity that went beyond clerical duty, experimenting with flourishes and strokes until his hand could mimic the look of another age. It was here that the first seed of deceit took root. The idea was deceptively simple. His father longed for a relic, something personal, something tangible from the hand of Shakespeare. If William could craft such a relic, even a minor one, he might finally win the admiration that had eluded him all his life. One evening, after hours bent over scraps of parchment, he produced his first attempt, a deed supposedly signed by William Shakespeare himself. He carefully imitated the archaic style of handwriting, stained the paper to suggest age, and even added the wax seal to lend an air of authenticity. When he presented it to his father, Samuel's reaction was everything William had dreamed of. The elder Ireland's eyes lit up with reverence as he turned the document over in his hands. He marveled at its apparent genuineness, praising his son for bringing such a treasure into the family. For the first time, William felt the warmth of approval, a pride that seemed to erase years of inadequacy. That single forged deed was more than a trick. It was the spark that ignited a fire. William had discovered the intoxicating power of creation, not as an artist, but as an impostor. And in Samuel's delight, William saw a path to the love he had always desired. But he could not have known that the path he chose would lead him deeper and deeper into a web of lies, from which escape would be impossible. The deed was only the beginning. Once William realized how easily his father could be convinced, the temptation to continue was irresistible. Each evening he returned to his clerk's desk with renewed purpose, poring over legal forms, studying archaic phrasing, and experimenting with ink recipes to give his creations the convincing hue of age. His hand grew more confident, his imagination bolder. Soon it was not enough to present a single scrap. He must produce more. Letters, notes, fragments of a voice long lost to time. and so the forgeries multiplied. The next treasure he revealed to his father was a love letter, tender words supposedly written by Shakespeare to his wife, Anne Hathaway. Samuel received it with trembling hands, his eyes brimming with emotion at the thought of glimpsing the private affection of the immortal bard. To him, it was as though the curtain had been pulled back on history itself. With every new discovery, William unveiled a poem, a devotional reflection, a scribbled note. The elder Ireland's joy grew into unshakable conviction. Samuel did not keep these wonders to himself. He began to invite scholars and collectors into his home, eager to display the relics his son had found. Learned men bent over the parchment, some squinting skeptically, but many nodding in solemn agreement that the documents bore the ring of authenticity. Their approval was intoxicating, not only for Samuel, but for William himself. The boy, who had once been invisible, now stood at the center of hushed admiration. He had conjured Shakespeare from the grave, and the world seemed ready to believe. But with each step deeper into the deception, William felt the weight of expectation tightening around him. To maintain the illusion, he needed to create more, always more, each forgery grander than the last. What began as a single attempt to win his father's affection had grown into a performance staged before London's intellectual elite. And as the circle of believers widened, so too did the risk. For every scholar who praised the discoveries, there was another who watched with quiet doubt, waiting for the cracks to show. Still, the applause drowned out suspicion. Samuel glowed with pride, never questioning the miracles his son delivered. For William, the praise was a drug, both thrilling and terrifying. He had given his father the relics he craved, but in doing so, he had created a monster of expectation, one that demanded constant feeding. And it would not be long before the forgery reached a scale that could no longer be contained within the walls of Samuel's study. The tide of invention showed no sign of slowing. Emboldened by the reverence his father and guests poured upon each new artifact, William pressed forward with creations that reached deeper into Shakespeare's imagined soul. A love letter was one thing, but soon he was drafting entire poems in the bard's voice, verses stitched together from fragments he had absorbed in his own reading. He wrote in clumsy imitations of Elizabethan style, scattering archaic spellings and flourishes to disguise the awkward rhythm. To his astonishment, the very features that betrayed his lack of skill were often taken as signs of Shakespeare's spontaneity, quirks of a genius rather than errors of a forger. He grew bolder still. One evening, Samuel unveiled a discovery so intimate it left visitors breathless. A confession of faith written in Shakespeare's hand, expressing pious devotion to the Church of England. In an age still scarred by religious conflict, this was not just a relic but a revelation, one that seemed to answer debates about Shakespeare's beliefs that had lingered for generations. Learned men hailed it as proof, praising Samuel Ireland's household as the site of an unparalleled treasure trove. And all the while, William, standing quietly in the background, listened to their praise, his heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and dread. Each forgery brought new waves of validation. Collectors arrived with coin purses heavy, offering to purchase fragments. Newspapers began to circulate whispers of the Ireland discoveries, stirring public curiosity. Samuel basked in the glow of attention, entertaining guests in his home with the air of a man who had been chosen by fate to guard the legacy of England's greatest writer. But for William, the glow concealed shadows. With every parchment he produced, the stakes grew higher. What had begun as a son's desperate bid for approval was spiraling into a performance on the stage of national culture. And yet, despite the pressure, William could not stop. Each document was both a deception and a lifeline, the only path by which he could sustain the fragile bond with his father. The thrill of being believed, of watching others marvel at his creations, outweighed the terror of exposure, for the moment. But the pattern of forgery was unsustainable. The appetite for Shakespeare was insatiable, and the more William fed it, the more it demanded. Inevitably, the hoax would grow beyond his control, and when it did, the consequences would be devastating. The tide of validation soon rose higher than William could have imagined. Samuel, eager to silence any whispers of doubt, began parading the documents before scholars of renown, confident that expert eyes would confirm their authenticity. To his delight, and to William's secret astonishment, many did just that. Learned men who had spent their lives poring over Elizabethan texts leaned over the parchments, nodding gravely as they traced the faded ink with their fingers. They admired the antiquated spellings, the peculiar turns of phrase, and the subtle discoloration of the paper. For them, these imperfections were not red flags, but proof of genuineness. One by one, voices of authority lent their approval. James Boswell, biographer of Samuel Johnson and a figure of towering literary reputation, declared himself profoundly moved when shown the relics. He wept openly at the sight of Shakespeare's supposed profession of faith, murmuring that he could now die content. Such displays of emotion, broadcast widely, sent ripples through the literary world. If Boswell could be convinced, who dared to contradict him? Others followed, some out of conviction, others perhaps out of eagerness to be aligned with what seemed the discovery of the century. Articles appeared in journals praising the treasures unearthed by Samuel Ireland. Collectors clamored for access, eager to see with their own eyes what the newspapers trumpeted as miracles. Each endorsement further insulated the hoax, wrapping William's forgeries in a cloak of legitimacy that seemed impenetrable. For William, the experience was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The quiet boy who had once been invisible now watched as the greatest minds of his age bent themselves in awe before words of his own invention. Yet beneath the rush of triumph was a growing dread. Each new declaration of authenticity was another chain binding him to the lie. Exposure no longer threatened only his fragile bond with his father. It threatened to unravel reputations across London, to humiliate men who had staked their honour on the veracity of his work. Still, the hoax continued to swell, carried on the tide of belief. The circle of admirers grew wider, the stakes higher, the pressure unbearable. With every scholar who nodded in solemn agreement, William's fear deepened. For he knew the truth with a clarity none of them possessed. The house of cards was rising skyward, but it rested on a foundation of sand. And one tremor, one piercing question could bring the entire edifice crashing down. The scandal did not remain confined to the drawing rooms of scholars and collectors. Word of the discoveries spilled into the streets of London, where rumour and curiosity fanned the flames of obsession. By now, the Ireland household had become a kind of shrine, a place where visitors queued to glimpse relics they believed had survived the centuries. Aristocrats and gentlemen of fortune made their way to Samuel's study, eager to lay eyes upon the parchments said to bear the hand of Shakespeare. Some brought purses heavy with coin, offering sums that would have staggered William had he not already been dizzy from the deception. The fervour spread beyond the elite. Newspapers carried tantalizing accounts of the documents, stirring a frenzy among the public. Coffee houses buzzed with speculation. Was it true? Had the great poet left behind hidden treasures, locked away and only now revealed? Readers devoured every scrap of news, while caricaturists and pamphleteers began producing sketches and verses celebrating the miracle of Shakespeare's return. In taverns and parlours alike, the name of William Shakespeare was on every tongue, and attached to it, in whispers and admiration, the name of Samuel Ireland. For Samuel, it was a golden season. He basked in the attention, delighted in the steady stream of visitors who flattered his discernment and praised his good fortune. The relics became his life's crowning achievement, the discovery he believed would etch his family's name into history. William, standing at his father's side, could scarcely believe the spectacle he had created. What had begun as a desperate attempt to win approval had become a mania sweeping through London. He had conjured not just forged ink on paper, but a fever in the minds of men and women hungry to believe. And yet, beneath the triumph, the noose of expectation tightened. Each new admirer demanded to see something fresh, something greater than the last. The appetite for Shakespeare was insatiable. A letter, a sonnet, even a devotional fragment no longer seemed enough. Whispers grew of larger discoveries still to come. William felt the weight of those whispers pressing on him, dragging him toward a revelation that would eclipse all others. If the world wanted a lost play, a drama from the hand of Shakespeare himself, then he must find a way to deliver it. The stage was set for the most audacious forgery of all. The murmurs of expectation soon became a roar, and William, trapped in the web of his own making, felt the pressure sharpen into necessity. A handful of letters and sonnets could no longer satisfy a public hungry for revelation. What England longed for was not fragments, but a masterpiece, a drama that might stand alongside Hamlet or Macbeth, something that would place the Ireland discoveries beyond question. And so William, with trembling hand and reckless ambition, began to craft what he would later call his boldest fraud, an entire play written in the supposed hand of William Shakespeare. He gave it the title Vortigern and Rowena, borrowing from ancient British legend. In its pages, he poured all the mimicry he could muster, stringing together imitations of Shakespearean cadence, scattering archaisms, and borrowing liberally from the actual plays he had studied. The result was uneven, clumsy in places, but William believed it would suffice. After all, had not scholars already convinced themselves that his scraps and fragments were authentic? Would they dare to doubt a full drama when their reputations had already been staked on his earlier forgeries? When Samuel received the manuscript, he was overcome with joy. Tears filled his eyes as he clutched the parchment, proclaiming it the greatest discovery in literary history. He wasted no time in spreading the news. Word of a lost Shakespeare play thundered through London, electrifying the cultural elite. Collectors clamoured for a glimpse, while scholars praised the find with near-religious reverence. To doubt was to risk ridicule. To believe was to share in glory. The excitement reached such a pitch that Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the celebrated playwright and manager of Drury Lane Theatre, secured the rights to stage the drama. It was an irresistible opportunity. A lost Shakespeare, revived for the stage, would guarantee overflowing houses and immortal fame. Sheridan, no stranger to spectacle, understood the value of such a performance, even if whispers of doubt lingered at the edges. For William, the announcement was both triumph and terror. To forge scraps in private was one thing. To see an entire play performed before thousands was something altogether more perilous. The illusion would no longer rest on parchment alone, but on living voices, lights, and the unforgiving gaze of an audience. Still, the current of events swept him along, and there was no turning back. The fraud had grown too large, the expectations too immense. The curtain was rising on his greatest deception, and with it, the beginning of his inevitable ruin. The announcement of Vortigern and Rowena spread through London like wildfire. Tickets for its premiere at Drury Lane were snatched up with feverish haste, for who could resist the chance to witness a play unseen for 2 centuries? The promise of Shakespeare resurrected filled the theatre with anticipation long before a single line was spoken. Yet behind the scenes, beneath the velvet curtains and polished stage boards, unease stirred among the actors. Sheridan, the theatre's manager, understood both the opportunity and the risk. He was a man well acquainted with the whims of audiences, and though he welcomed the guaranteed profits, he could not ignore the whispers that the play's authenticity was doubtful. Still, the allure was irresistible. Sheridan instructed his company to prepare for the performance, but in rehearsal rooms, doubts deepened with every read-through. The actors, seasoned in the rhythms of Shakespeare's genuine works, struggled with William's counterfeit verse. The lines, dressed in archaic spellings and lofty diction, often collapsed into awkward phrasing, stumbling where Shakespeare's poetry should have soared. Veteran performers whispered complaints to one another, exchanging skeptical glances as they forced their tongues around words that rang hollow. Some joked darkly that if this was truly Shakespeare, then he must have been having an off day. Despite the grumbling, preparations pressed on. Costumes were fitted, sets painted, and the playbill proudly bore the title of a newly discovered masterpiece. Samuel Ireland, radiant with pride, attended rehearsals with the air of a man witnessing history in the making. He ignored the muttered doubts of actors and staff, convinced that the majesty of the bard would shine through when the curtain rose. For William, standing at the edge of rehearsals, the experience was unbearable. Each time he heard an actor stumble or a line draw nervous laughter, he felt the walls closing in. His creation, crafted in solitude and deception, was about to be thrust beneath the brightest lights of London. Yet the machinery of theatre could not be halted. Drury Lane was committed, the public was expectant, and the date of performance drew nearer with each passing day. What had once been William's private bid for love had swelled into a national event, one that would be remembered whether it ended in triumph or disaster. And in the growing tension of rehearsal halls, the outcome seemed already to lean toward the latter. The night of reckoning was approaching, and William could do nothing but watch as his forgery marched inevitably toward exposure. On the night of March 23rd, 1796, Drury Lane Theatre swelled with expectation. The chandeliers blazed, illuminating a sea of eager faces. Noblemen in their finery leaned over the balconies, murmuring with excitement, while the pit overflowed with tradesmen and clerks who had paid dearly for a chance to witness the miracle. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the sense that history was about to unfold before them. For many in the crowd, the evening promised more than entertainment. It was communion with the past, an encounter with the genius of William Shakespeare himself, newly unearthed after 2 centuries of silence. The orchestra struck its opening notes, the curtain rose, and the first lines of Vortigern and Rowena echoed across the stage. For a fleeting moment, the illusion held. The audience listened with reverence, leaning forward as though to catch the whispered secrets of time. But as the dialogue unfolded, unease rippled through the theatre. The lines, stiff and ungainly, lacked the music that had immortalized Shakespeare's verse. Where the bard's words soared with wit and rhythm, these faltered and fell heavy. Actors strained to deliver them with conviction, but even their skill could not disguise the awkwardness. The murmurs began quietly, a ripple of confusion that spread like cracks in ice. A misplaced line drew a stifled chuckle. An overwrought phrase provoked scattered laughter. By the second act, the dam broke. Whole sections of the audience laughed openly, jeering at the absurdity of what they heard. The pit roared with mockery, while gentlemen in the boxes exchanged sly smiles. Critics scribbled furiously in their notebooks, sensing the scandal that was unfolding before them. The actors, caught in the storm, fought to maintain composure. Some pushed harder, delivering their lines with desperate intensity, while others faltered under the weight of ridicule. The performance staggered on, but the magic was gone. What was meant to be the triumphant resurrection of Shakespeare had become a public farce. In the wings, Samuel Ireland sat stiffly, his pride unraveling with each roar of laughter, and William, pale and trembling, felt his world collapsing. His great illusion, crafted with ink and imagination, was dying before his eyes. What had begun as a son's plea for love now lay exposed as a fraud, ridiculed by thousands. When the curtain finally fell, it did so not to applause, but to a storm of scorn. The hoax had reached its climax, and in that moment, its downfall was sealed. The morning after the debacle at Drury Lane, London was alive with gossip. The jeers and laughter that had filled the theatre spread into coffee-houses and taverns, retold with relish by those who claimed to have witnessed the humiliation firsthand. Newspapers wasted no time sharpening their pens. Reviews dripped with sarcasm, mocking the clumsy verse and ridiculing the very notion that such lines could have come from Shakespeare's hand. What had been billed as a cultural miracle now stood exposed as a farce, and the ridicule was merciless. For Samuel Ireland, the humiliation was unbearable. He had invited critics and men of learning into his home, boasting of the treasures his son had unearthed. Now, those same men whispered behind fans and cups of coffee that Samuel had been duped, that he was a fool, blinded by his own obsession. The reputation he had cherished, the respect he had cultivated as a gentleman of letters, began to crumble overnight. Each article, each caricature seemed to peel away another layer of dignity. The public, ever hungry for spectacle, turned the scandal into entertainment. Satirical prints flooded the streets, lampooning the performance and mocking those who had believed. In one cartoon, Shakespeare himself was depicted laughing from the heavens, quill in hand, as gullible scholars bowed before William Henry Ireland's forgeries. The laughter that had echoed through Drury Lane now reverberated across the city. Meanwhile, William shrank into himself. He had long feared exposure, but he had not imagined the speed or scale of the backlash. What had once seemed a triumph of cunning now felt like a nightmare unraveling around him. The thrill of deceiving scholars, of basking in their praise, was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of guilt and dread. Yet even then, he could not bring himself to step forward. To confess would mean not only his ruin, but the total destruction of his father, whose pride had been so completely bound to the forgeries. Still, suspicion was no longer confined to murmurs. Scholars who had once nodded in approval now revisited the documents with fresh eyes, emboldened by the collapse of Vortigern and Rowena. Errors once excused as quirks now looked like glaring signs of fraud. The tide was turning, and it carried with it an air of inevitability. The great discovery was being unmasked, and soon the entire web of lies would be dragged into the harsh light of truth. The collapse of Vortigern and Rowena ignited a frenzy of re-examination. Those who had once sung praises of the Ireland relics now returned to them with sharpened eyes, no longer swayed by the glamour of supposed discovery. The laughter that had filled Drury Lane had stripped away the awe, leaving only suspicion, and suspicion quickly grew into certainty. One by one, the documents were subjected to the scrutiny of men determined to restore their reputations by unmasking the fraud. The errors leapt from the page. Scholars pointed out words and phrases that Shakespeare could not possibly have written, expressions that belonged not to the Elizabethan age, but to William Henry Ireland's own 18th-century tongue. Spellings that William had deliberately twisted in an effort to sound archaic were revealed as clumsy imitations, inconsistent with genuine documents of the time. Watermarks in the paper betrayed its recent origin, while the ink, though aged with artifice, lacked the natural corrosion expected of manuscripts centuries old. What had once been admired as signs of authenticity were now ridiculed as the bungling of a forger. Critics who had dared voice doubts earlier now found themselves vindicated. George Stevens, a formidable Shakespearean scholar, declared the relics laughable fabrications, their errors so glaring that only blind devotion could have accepted them as genuine. Others piled on with essays, pamphlets, and lectures, dismantling the documents line by line, exposing William's borrowings from printed editions of Shakespeare, revealing the anachronisms, and mocking the sentimentality of the forged love letters. The supposed profession of faith, once hailed by Boswell as divine revelation, was denounced as a crude attempt to settle theological debates by putting words into Shakespeare's mouth. The more the forgeries were examined, the more damning the evidence became. The house of cards William had built in secrecy now collapsed in public view, each revelation tearing away another piece of the illusion. Those who had believed most fervently now scrambled to distance themselves, claiming they had always harbored doubts, eager to wash away the stain of gullibility. Samuel Ireland's name, once tied to glory, was now a byword for credulous folly. For William, the scrutiny was unbearable. He alone knew the truth in all its detail, the painstaking nights of copying, staining, and fabricating. He watched as experts tore apart the work of his own hands, each exposure cutting deeper into the fragile pride that had once buoyed him. Yet even as the evidence mounted, he clung to silence, unwilling to admit publicly what in his heart he could no longer deny. The fraud had been unmasked, and its architect could no longer hide. No figure bore the weight of disgrace more heavily than Samuel Ireland. For years he had basked in the glow of supposed discovery, welcoming scholars and gentlemen into his home, proudly displaying the relics that he believed would cement his legacy. Now, those same relics had become the instruments of his humiliation. Where once visitors had entered his study with reverence, they now spoke of it with scorn, recalling how he had paraded forgeries before them with unshakable conviction. The laughter that erupted at Drury Lane seemed to echo endlessly in his ears, a cruel refrain reminding him of his folly. Samuel had not forged the documents himself, but his name had become inseparably bound to them. In the public eye, he was the guardian of the hoax, the man so blinded by obsession that he could not distinguish truth from deceit. Caricatures showed him as a doddering fool, bowing reverently to scraps of paper, while Shakespeare from heaven mocked him. Newspapers sharpened their ridicule, portraying him as the willing dupe of a scheme that any sensible man should have seen through. It mattered little that the fraud had sprung from his son's hand. To the world, Samuel Ireland had been the chief believer, and belief was now indistinguishable from guilt. At home, the tension between father and son thickened into something unbearable. William, consumed by guilt, could scarcely look his father in the eye. He had set out to win Samuel's love, to draw from him a pride that had always seemed just out of reach. Instead, he had delivered shame, stripping his father of dignity and turning his name into a national joke. Samuel, though wounded to the core, could not bring himself to admit the truth either. He clung to the possibility that the experts were mistaken, that the relics were genuine after all, even as evidence to the contrary mounted on every side. The humiliation aged him quickly. Friends who once visited drifted away. Invitations ceased. His study, once bustling with admirers, grew silent. He found himself isolated, not only from society, but from the world of letters that had once defined him. For Samuel, the scandal was not just a blow to reputation, but a destruction of identity. He had built his life around Shakespeare, and now Shakespeare had been turned against him, leaving nothing but ashes of a dream. It was a burden no father should have had to bear, and it was only the beginning of the suffering the scandal would bring. At last, the pressure became unbearable. The laughter of the public, the scorn of scholars, and the crushing sight of his father's humiliation drove William Henry Ireland to a breaking point. He had remained silent through the early days of exposure, clinging to the hope that the storm might somehow pass. But the storm only grew fiercer, and William knew that the truth could not be hidden forever. In 1796, still reeling from the disaster of Vortigern and Rowena, he stepped forward to confess. His admission was at once shocking and pathetic. He revealed that every relic, the deeds, the love letters, the poems, the devotional passages, and the infamous play itself, had sprung from his own imagination. With trembling honesty, he described the methods he had used. The aged paper had come from the solicitor's office where he worked, scraps of old parchment left unused and forgotten. He had practiced Elizabethan handwriting obsessively until he could mimic its peculiar flourishes. The ink, carefully concocted, was darkened and diluted to mimic the uneven strokes of a 17th-century pen. In some cases, he had even smoked the paper or stained it with liquid to suggest the wear of centuries. As he recounted his methods, it became clear that William had been both painstaking and careless. He had studied Shakespeare closely enough to reproduce a semblance of style, but not deeply enough to avoid errors that a true scholar would have noticed. He had altered spellings at random, convinced that archaism alone would lend credibility. He had lifted phrases from printed editions, scattering them clumsily across his own imitations. What he had created was not Shakespeare resurrected, but a patchwork of mimicry, stitched together by desperation and audacity. William insisted that his motive had never been wealth or malice. He claimed that he sought only to win the affection of his father, to bring joy to a man whose life was devoted to Shakespeare. It was a plea for understanding, an attempt to soften the judgment of a public eager for blood. But whether born of love or deceit, the result was the same. A deception that had shaken the literary world, ruined reputations, and plunged his own family into disgrace. The confession, rather than redeeming him, sealed his fate. Some scoffed at his account, accusing him of lying even in confession, while others condemned him as a trickster who had toyed with the nation's cultural pride. William had laid bare his fraud, but in doing so, he had written the epitaph of his own reputation. The confession landed in London like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every circle that had once celebrated the so-called discoveries. Some reacted with outrage, declaring that William Henry Ireland had committed nothing less than a cultural crime. Others reacted with incredulity, unable or unwilling to believe that a youth of such obscurity could have deceived men of learning, wealth, and reputation so thoroughly. The scandal deepened not merely because of the fraud itself, but because it revealed how easily the guardians of culture could be blinded by desire. Samuel Ireland suffered most cruelly in the immediate aftermath. Though William had taken responsibility, the public was merciless in its judgment. Pamphlets mocked Samuel's gullibility, caricatures portrayed him as a fool, and newspapers derided his eagerness to embrace fantasy. He was no longer seen as a victim of deception, but as a willing accomplice, a man whose vanity had made him an easy mark. His study, once filled with visitors, grew silent as former friends abandoned him, unwilling to be associated with his disgrace. For William, the confession did not bring relief. Instead, it drew the spotlight more firmly upon him. He was denounced in print as a trickster, a liar, a forger who had made fools of England's greatest minds. The same pens that had once praised the Ireland relics now carved his name into infamy. Critics demanded punishment, though the law offered little ground for prosecution. William was not imprisoned, but the weight of public scorn was punishment enough. He could scarcely walk the streets without feeling the sting of whispered ridicule, the furtive glances that marked him out as the architect of disgrace. And yet, even in condemnation, there was fascination. The scandal was irresistible, a drama that combined betrayal, obsession, and spectacle. The confession was published, dissected, and debated. Some readers found in William's words a pathetic honesty, a glimpse of a boy crushed by the need for love. Others dismissed it as yet another layer of deceit. The truth mattered less than the scandal itself, which by now had taken on a life of its own, feeding on the shame of the islands and the glee of a public that delighted in watching reputations topple. The stage that had once been set for Shakespeare's resurrection now served as the theatre of disgrace. And for William Henry Ireland, the curtain had only just begun to fall. In the weeks and months that followed his confession, William Henry Ireland found himself adrift in a city that seemed to take pleasure in his downfall. London society, which had once treated the Ireland household as a shrine to Shakespeare, now turned its back with ruthless finality. William's name was spoken with contempt in coffee-houses, invoked as a cautionary tale in salons, and ridiculed in newspapers that once trumpeted his discoveries with reverence. The boy who had dreamed of earning admiration was now the most infamous figure in the literary world, a pariah marked not by crime of violence, but by deceit. Social invitations vanished. Doors that had once opened to Samuel and William alike now remained firmly shut. Friends, eager to protect their own reputations, distanced themselves, leaving the family isolated. William, scarcely more than a youth, bore the full force of a city's ridicule. In the streets he was recognized, pointed at, whispered about. Children repeated cruel jokes, while adults scoffed at the mere mention of his name. He was, in the eyes of the public, not just a failed forger, but a symbol of shame. Satirists ensured that his disgrace would linger. Caricatures showed William hunched over parchment, grinning devilishly as he scribbled false verses. In one widely circulated print, he was depicted leading a procession of duped scholars, blindfolded and stumbling, while Shakespeare's ghost laughed above. Pamphlets exaggerated his motives, portraying him as a cunning schemer who had set out to humiliate England itself. The truth, that he had been a lonely boy seeking a father's affection, was drowned beneath the roar of mockery. For William, exile was not a matter of geography, but of belonging. He lived in the same city, walked the same streets, yet he no longer felt part of its life. Each step carried the weight of invisible chains, the burden of disgrace that no confession could erase. Attempts to defend himself only deepened suspicion, for the public had already written the narrative it preferred. William Henry Ireland, the forger who tried to resurrect Shakespeare and failed in the most spectacular fashion. The ridicule reached far beyond him, staining his entire family. Samuel's reputation was ruined, his daughters tainted by association, his household transformed from a place of curiosity into one of scorn. The scandal had not only destroyed William's dreams, but had poisoned the Ireland name. And though time would eventually dull the sting, the years immediately after the hoax were ones of exile, an exile not from place, but from respectability, trust, and the fragile love William had sought all along. As the dust of the scandal began to settle, William Henry Ireland sought one last refuge, the written word. If society had condemned him, if caricaturists and critics had painted him as a conniving fraud, then perhaps he could reclaim his story by telling it in his own voice. And so, only months after the disaster at Drury Lane, he published a book with a title as bold as its contents, an authentic account of the Shakespearean manuscripts. In its pages, he laid out a full confession, describing the origins of the forgeries, the methods by which he had aged paper and ink, and the desperate motives that had driven him to deception. He presented himself not as a schemer, but as a boy ensnared by the weight of his father's obsession. Again and again, he returned to the theme of paternal approval, insisting that every counterfeit was born not of malice, but of longing. He confessed how he had scavenged parchment from the solicitor's office, how he had smoked the paper to give it the look of centuries, how he had studied Elizabethan handwriting until his own hand could mimic its strange loops and flourishes. Each detail was offered as evidence not of his cunning, but of his pathetic devotion, his willingness to sacrifice truth itself in order to be loved. The memoirs fascinated the public, though not always in the way William intended. Some readers, moved by his candor, admitted to a kind of pity. They saw in his words the portrait of a fragile soul caught in the machinery of society's hunger for relics. Others dismissed the book as nothing more than a new performance, another layer of deceit crafted to win sympathy. To them, William was still a trickster, clever enough to manipulate not just parchment and ink but the emotions of his readers. The literary world received the book with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Critics dissected his claims, questioning whether he had confessed to every detail or withheld certain truths, yet even in scorn, they could not look away. The forger's memoirs became part of the scandal's afterlife, a document that both exposed and perpetuated the very fraud it described. For William, the book was both a lifeline and a chain. It gave him a voice in a world determined to mock him, yet it also fixed him forever in the role of forger. He had written his own defense, but in doing so, he had etched his name more deeply into the annals of disgrace. If William's confession had sealed his own infamy, it had also dealt a mortal wound to his father. Samuel Ireland, once a respected collector and man of letters, could not survive the weight of humiliation that now pressed upon him. In drawing rooms and coffee houses, his name became shorthand for gullibility. He was remembered not for his engravings or his contributions to art, but for the moment he had bowed reverently before his son's forgeries. For Samuel, whose pride had always been bound to his role as a discerning man of culture, the disgrace was unbearable. Friends who had once crowded his home now vanished. Invitations ceased, correspondence dwindled, and Samuel found himself alone with the relics of his ruined reputation. To admit that his son had deceived him was agony, but to insist on the document's authenticity was worse, for it made him appear delusional in the face of overwhelming evidence. He was trapped between denial and despair, each path leading only to further shame. The ridicule extended into the popular imagination. Caricatures did not spare him, often showing Samuel kneeling before scraps of paper while Shakespeare's ghost mocked him from the clouds. These cruel images circulated through London's streets, purchased for pennies, laughed at by strangers who had never met him. Samuel, once proud of the attention he commanded, now dreaded the very mention of his name. At home, the atmosphere was heavy with bitterness. William's attempts at justification, his confessions and memoirs, only deepened the father's anguish. It was not enough that Samuel had been deceived. Now the world knew the details of how he had been deceived, laid bare by his own son's pen. The wound was public, unhealed, and unending. Where William still clung to a kind of morbid fame, Samuel could see only ruin. The humiliation took its toll on his health. Friends who glimpsed him in later years described a man prematurely aged, his spirit broken, his passion for collecting gone cold. The pride that had once animated him had withered. His name, he knew, would be preserved not in honour but in ridicule, linked forever to a scandal that had scarred England's literary world. By the time Samuel Ireland died in 1800, the shadow of the hoax still hung over him. He left this world not as the careful scholar he had hoped to be remembered, but as the tragic first casualty of his son's deception, a man undone by love of Shakespeare, betrayed by love of family, and consumed by the shame of a scandal from which he never recovered. Even after Samuel's death, the scandal refused to fade. London had a long memory when it came to humiliation, and the Ireland hoax provided endless fuel for ridicule. Ballads were sung in taverns, mocking both the gullible father and the deceitful son. In satirical verses, Shakespeare was imagined laughing in his grave, bemused at the clumsy words that had been put into his mouth. Caricatures continued to appear, sometimes years after the first exposure, recycling the familiar image of William bent over parchment, scribbling forgeries while learned men bowed in reverence. The story became a kind of cultural shorthand, a joke retold whenever questions of authenticity arose. Scholars and collectors who had once praised the manuscripts now used the affair as a cautionary tale, shaking their heads at the dangers of wishful thinking. The Ireland name lingered on people's lips, not as a family of achievement, but as a family of folly. For William, this was a peculiar torment. He was not forgotten, but remembered only for the very thing he most wished to escape. Infamy clung to him more tightly than fame ever could. The scandal also seeped into literature and conversation beyond London. Pamphlets and essays spread the tale across England, ensuring that William's misdeeds would not be confined to one city. Abroad, too, reports of the hoax reached readers in France and Germany, who marvelled at the audacity of the forger and the credulity of those who believed him. The affair, once a source of national pride, had become an international embarrassment, a story England's cultural guardians would never live down, and yet fascination mingled with mockery. The public could not quite turn away. There was something irresistible about the spectacle of a youth duping the guardians of England's greatest treasure, something both shocking and oddly entertaining. It appealed to the same hunger that had first made the forgeries seem plausible, the desire for mystery, for lost voices returned, for history resurrected. Now that desire was turned inside out, fueling laughter rather than reverence. William, for his part, lived under the shadow of this strange afterlife. Every attempt to redefine himself was drowned by the echoes of the hoax. His name, once associated with discovery, now served as a punchline. He had given the world a scandal it would not forget, and in return, the world had given him the kind of immortality no man could envy. The scandal of William Henry Ireland did not emerge in isolation. The 18th century was a fertile ground for deception, an age when the hunger for antiquity often outpaced the ability to verify it. Collectors scoured the countryside for relics, manuscripts and artifacts, desperate to connect themselves to a past they revered. Museums were still in their infancy, scholarship lacked the rigorous tools it would later develop, and the line between discovery and invention was perilously thin. Into this world, forgery thrived. Ireland was far from the only figure to exploit this weakness. In the decades before his hoax, other literary frauds had surfaced with varying degrees of success. The so-called Rowley poems, presented by Thomas Chatterton as the work of a 15th-century monk, had captivated readers before being exposed as the fabrications of a precocious teenager. The poems, though false in origin, were admired for their beauty, and Chatterton himself achieved a kind of tragic fame when he died young. His story, whispered through London, offered both inspiration and warning to William Henry Ireland, who must have known how the public's hunger for lost voices could be manipulated. Beyond literature, the 18th century teemed with false relics and counterfeit antiquities. Dealers in art and manuscripts trafficked in objects of dubious provenance, often dressing up the ordinary with the patina of age to satisfy wealthy patrons eager for connection to history. The trade in fakes was not merely tolerated, but, in some cases, quietly encouraged, for it fed the appetites of those who wanted to believe. It was a world where authenticity was assumed more than proven, and where skepticism was often drowned by the thrill of possession. The Ireland scandal fit seamlessly into this culture of credulity. His documents were welcomed not only because they seemed to illuminate Shakespeare, but because they fulfilled a cultural desire that had been primed by decades of longing. England wanted more of its greatest poet, and when William offered that gift, society seized it without hesitation. That so many men of learning were fooled spoke not only to William's craft, but to the vulnerability of a world intoxicated by the dream of rediscovery. When the hoax collapsed, it was not merely a personal disgrace. It became emblematic of an age's weakness, a lesson in the perils of unchecked desire. William Henry Ireland was singled out as the forger, but in truth, the scandal belonged as much to the society that had embraced him as to the boy who had wielded the pen. To understand the strange persistence of William Henry Ireland's hoax, one must look beyond the forgeries themselves and into the mind of the forger. He was not, as many assumed, a cold schemer intent on defrauding the world for profit. His own writings, and the testimony of those who knew him, reveal a youth whose every action was coloured by longing. A longing for recognition, for love, and most of all for the approval of his father. From childhood, William had lived in the shadow of Samuel Ireland's passions. His father's life revolved around Shakespeare, collecting, and the company of learned men, while William, awkward and unremarkable, struggled to find a place in that world. He craved affection, but Samuel's pride seemed always reserved for the relics of the past, not the son who stood before him. When William first placed a forged document in his father's hands, the thrill came not from the deception itself, but from the look of wonder in Samuel's eyes. For perhaps the first time, William felt that he had given his father something worthy, something that could not be dismissed. That moment became the pattern for everything that followed. Each forgery was both a performance and a plea, an attempt to bind himself to a man who seemed otherwise unreachable. The applause of scholars and collectors was intoxicating, but the true audience was always his father. William's fraud was not sustained by greed, but by an emotional hunger that no confession could ever satisfy. Yet woven into that hunger was something darker, a thrill in the act of creation itself. William was not a great writer, but he could mimic with enough skill to convince. To craft words and have them mistaken for Shakespeare's was, in its own twisted way, a form of authorship. He had conjured an illusion so powerful that the learned men of his age had bowed before it. In the private corners of his mind, that triumph must have burned with equal parts pride and terror. This duality defined him, the desperate son and the secret creator, the boy who wanted only to be loved and the forger who discovered the dangerous pleasure of invention. The hoax was born from weakness, but sustained by exhilaration, a paradox that left William trapped between shame and pride. And when the edifice collapsed, it left not only his reputation in ruins, but also the fragile structure of his own identity. If William Henry Ireland's forgeries had been flimsy, if they had been examined with a cold eye and dismissed at once, the scandal might have ended quietly. But the truth is more unsettling. The hoax succeeded for so long not because of William's genius, but because society itself wanted it to succeed. England, at the close of the 18th century, was desperate for miracles. The cult of Shakespeare had reached a fever pitch, and with it came an almost religious yearning for relics of the national poet. That yearning blinded the guardians of culture and turned suspicion into silence. Every detail William supplied, no matter how improbable, was received with eagerness. A sonnet that seemed clumsy was praised as a rare glimpse of Shakespeare's private voice. A letter filled with sentimentality was embraced as evidence of his tenderness. Even the awkward rhythms of Vortigern and Rowena were, in the weeks before its performance, excused as quirks of genius rather than flaws. To doubt was to risk ridicule, to risk standing apart from the swelling tide of belief. And so many chose belief, even when their instincts whispered otherwise. The hunger for discovery extended beyond scholars. Collectors and patrons saw in the manuscripts an opportunity to attach their names to history, to possess something no rival could boast. Newspapers, eager for sensational stories, amplified the excitement without question. Audiences, weary of ordinary amusements, longed for a spectacle that would connect them to the immortal bard. William did not deceive a skeptical public. He delivered exactly what they craved. In this sense, the hoax was less an act of solitary fraud than a collaboration between deceiver and deceived. William supplied the words, but the world supplied the faith. The scandal revealed an uncomfortable truth, that even the most learned men could be blinded when desire outweighed reason. The forgeries did not merely exploit scholarly weakness. They exposed the very human need to believe in wonders, to fill the silences of history with comforting stories. When the truth emerged, outrage fell squarely on William, but the deeper guilt belonged to a society that had chosen illusion over truth. His deception was the mirror in which they saw their own credulity reflected, and it was this reflection that stung most bitterly. The scandal was not simply the story of a boy's lies, but of a culture so enamored with Shakespeare that it mistook wishful thinking for fact. When the curtain fell on Vortigern and Rowena and the hoax began to unravel, it was not only the Ireland family who bore the sting of disgrace. Around them lay a trail of ruined reputations and wounded pride. Collectors who had paid generously for scraps of parchment found themselves mocked for their gullibility. Scholars who had written essays praising the manuscripts now scrambled to erase their names from the scandal, their authority diminished by their eagerness to believe. Even patrons of the arts, men and women of status who had lent their reputations to the supposed discoveries, became targets of whispered laughter. James Boswell, who had wept openly over Shakespeare's forged profession of faith, was ridiculed in drawing rooms long after his tears had dried. The image of a celebrated biographer overcome by a forgery became a favorite anecdote among his detractors. Others who had endorsed the manuscripts fared no better. To have believed was to have been exposed, and exposure carried a weight of humiliation from which many never recovered. Some lost more than pride. Collectors who had parted with money in exchange for relics found themselves with worthless scraps, investments turned into emblems of folly. Legal disputes flickered at the edges of the scandal, though most were reluctant to bring them forward, fearing further ridicule in the courts. The financial losses were less ruinous than the reputational ones, but they deepened the bitterness that followed William wherever he went. Even Sheridan, the playwright and theatre manager who had staged Vortigern, could not escape unscathed. Though his reputation was too large to be destroyed, he was mocked for his willingness to profit from a fraud. His Drury Lane theatre remembered less for triumph than for laughter at a counterfeit Shakespeare. Actors, too, bore scars from the fiasco, their performances replayed in cruel anecdotes told at their expense. The hoax had begun in the solitude of William's imagination, but by the time it collapsed, its ruin had spread far beyond him. It had touched every corner of London's cultural life, dragging scholars, collectors, patrons and performers into its wake. Each was left with some measure of shame, a reminder of how quickly desire for greatness could turn into complicity in deceit. In the end, William had not merely forged Shakespeare, he had forged a scandal that ensnared all who had dared to believe. As the years passed, the fury of the scandal gave way to something colder: indifference. The laughter that once echoed through London's streets softened, replaced by silence, and in that silence, William Henry Ireland found no redemption. He had hoped, perhaps, that time would dull the memory of his disgrace, that the public would forgive the folly of youth. Instead, the scandal clung to him like a shadow, ensuring that every attempt to begin anew was poisoned before it could take root. In the wake of his confession and memoirs, William struggled to find direction. The notoriety that had once surrounded his name made steady employment elusive. Publishers hesitated to trust him, collectors avoided him, and even ordinary work was scarce for a man whose very identity had become synonymous with fraud. He drifted between small literary ventures, producing minor writings and translations, none of which earned him either respect or financial security. Each effort seemed to collapse under the weight of his past, as though the world could not separate William the man from William the forger. Poverty soon became his constant companion. Accounts from the early 19th century describe him living in shabby lodgings, reliant on odd jobs and occasional charity. He married, fathered children, and yet was unable to provide them with stability. The family endured stretches of hardship, their lives overshadowed by the stigma of the hoax. Neighbours and acquaintances knew who he was, and the knowledge coloured every interaction, a quiet reminder that disgrace does not easily die. William continued to write, as though driven by the same compulsion that had once led him to forge, but the words no longer commanded attention. His later works slipped into obscurity, dismissed by critics and ignored by readers. What little fame he retained existed only in the memory of his crime. He had achieved the peculiar immortality of infamy. Everyone knew his name, but only as a synonym for deceit. The final decades of his life were marked by decline. Ill health compounded his struggles, and the meagre earnings from his pen barely sustained him. He lived to see the 19th century progress, to see Shakespeare's reputation grow ever greater, while his own dwindled into a footnote of disgrace. By the time of his death in 1835, William Henry Ireland was a forgotten man, remembered only by scholars and satirists who invoked his name as a warning. His life, once touched by notoriety, had ended in obscurity, poverty, and regret. In many ways, the strangest victim of the Ireland scandal was Shakespeare himself, or rather, the image of Shakespeare that England had constructed by the late 18th century. The bard had become more than a playwright. He was a symbol of national genius, a figure cloaked in reverence, half man and half myth. His plays were performed across Europe, his words enshrined in libraries and quoted in Parliament, yet his personal life remained a mystery. Into that void of silence, William Henry Ireland poured his inventions, giving Shakespeare the letters, prayers, and confessions the nation longed to see. The forgeries exploited not the historical man, but the cultural ghost that hovered over England. When William forged a love letter to Anne Hathaway, readers embraced it because they wanted Shakespeare to be a devoted husband. When he penned a religious confession, they hailed it as proof that the poet shared their own beliefs. Each forgery was not merely a document, but a mirror, reflecting back the desires of a society that wished Shakespeare to be everything at once: pious, passionate, wise, and immortal. This was the true danger of the hoax. It revealed how Shakespeare had ceased to be a playwright and had become a canvas onto which the nation painted its ideals. William's crude imitations succeeded not because they were skillful, but because they conformed to the stories people wanted to believe. The documents did not challenge their understanding of Shakespeare, they affirmed it, and in that affirmation, skepticism was silenced. Even Vortigern and Rowena, laughable as it seems now, was embraced for a time because it fit the myth of Shakespeare as a wellspring of endless genius capable of producing yet another tragedy lost to history. Only when the curtain rose and the words fell flat did the illusion break. Shakespeare's ghost, so often summoned as a symbol of unity and pride, was suddenly mocked, dragged into the realm of ridicule by the clumsy ventriloquism of a forger. Yet the scandal did not diminish Shakespeare's legacy. If anything, it reinforced it. The exposure of the forgeries reminded England of the difference between imitation and genius, between counterfeit and truth. The bard emerged unscathed, his reputation towering even higher above the ruins of William Henry Ireland. But the incident left behind an unsettling truth, that even the greatest of icons could be used as instruments of deception, their silence filled not by fact, but by the fictions others wished to tell. The exposure of William Henry Ireland's forgeries did more than ruin a family. It reshaped the way scholars and collectors approached the past. Before the scandal, discovery often rested on faith. A relic that looked old, sounded plausible, and satisfied desire was readily embraced, especially if endorsed by men of reputation. But after the Ireland affair, faith alone was no longer enough. The sting of humiliation forced the literary world to adopt caution, to demand evidence where once they had accepted sentiment. The hoax left its fingerprints on Shakespearean studies most of all. No longer would a supposed relic be taken at face value. Manuscripts had to be examined with scientific rigor compared with authentic documents and tested against historical fact. The idea of authentication, still in its infancy, began to mature under the shadow of William's deceit. Forgeries could no longer be brushed aside as harmless curiosities. They were threats to the integrity of history itself. Each parchment, each fragment, became suspect until proven otherwise. Collectors, too, learned painful lessons. The eagerness that had once driven men to pay fortunes for scraps of paper gave way to suspicion. Fortunes had been lost, reputations broken, and no gentleman wished to be remembered as the next Samuel Ireland. The market for literary relics cooled, and with it the careless enthusiasm that had allowed forgeries to thrive. Though the appetite for antiquities never disappeared, it was tempered by caution born of humiliation. The scandal also shaped public imagination. For generations afterward, the name of William Henry Ireland was invoked whenever a new discovery surfaced. His hoax became a benchmark, a reminder that even the most dazzling find might conceal fraud. In this sense, his legacy was double-edged. He was condemned as a liar, but he also sharpened the instincts of those who followed. The very methods that unmasked him, close reading, analysis of ink and paper, historical cross-checking, would become the tools of modern scholarship. Ironically, the boy who had dreamed of giving his father glory had instead given the world a lesson in skepticism. The scandal reinforced Shakespeare's greatness by exposing the gulf between true genius and clumsy imitation, but it also revealed the frailty of human judgment, the ease with which desire can triumph over reason. In the ashes of disgrace, a new culture of vigilance was born, one that still bears the imprint of William Henry Ireland. His name endured not in honour, but as a warning etched into the foundations of literary study. On that night in March 1796, when the curtain fell at Drury Lane amid jeers and laughter, an illusion died in front of thousands. The dream that Shakespeare had returned, that his voice had reached across centuries, dissolved into ridicule, leaving behind only fragments of deception. Yet the scandal of William Henry Ireland was more than a single night's humiliation. It was the revelation of how far obsession, hunger and love could twist the truth, and how society itself is often complicit in the lies it chooses to believe. William had begun with a desperate impulse to win the affection of a father who seemed to love a dead poet more than his living son. From that impulse grew one of the most audacious literary frauds in history, a hoax that ensnared scholars, collectors, and audiences alike. Each forgery fed not only his father's pride, but the public's yearning for miracles. And when the house of cards collapsed, it crushed not only William's reputation, but his father's life and the dignity of all who had believed. The scandal revealed the double edge of human desire. We long for wonders, for relics that connect us to greatness, for stories that confirm the myths we cherish. Yet that very longing blinds us, making us complicit in deception. The Ireland forgeries succeeded because they told people what they wished to hear, that Shakespeare was more than a poet, that he was a husband of tender devotion, a man of unshakable faith, a genius whose voice still had more to give. When the truth emerged, it was not merely William who stood exposed, but the very culture that had welcomed his lies. And so, the hoax lingers as more than a curious footnote in literary history. It is a warning that echoes still, that the stories we most yearn to believe may be the very ones that deceive us. In the laughter of that audience at Drury Lane lies a truth darker than ridicule. That belief, unchecked, can become its own betrayal. This was the legacy of William Henry Ireland, the boy who forged Shakespeare. His deception destroyed his father, ruined his name, and yet gifted the world a bitter lesson. It is a story not of genius, but of weakness, not of triumph, but of hunger. And it remains a shadow upon the bright figure of Shakespeare, a reminder that even in reverence, human folly is never far behind. If this descent into the archives unsettled you, subscribe to the Macabre Record and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next case. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what part of the Shakespeare hoax struck you the most. Was it the hunger to believe, the forged faith, or the ruin it left behind? If there's a forgotten figure or scandal you want unearthed next, Leave your suggestion below. Share this episode with someone who loves dark history, and I'll meet you in the shadows of the next story.